Structures. They bring us a sense of familiarity throughout our days as the sun sets and bring comfort and security at night while we sleep. Structures give us shelter or a place to view the unusual, or gather with thousands to be entertained or educated. Structures can take up large spaces and impede flows of people and traffic as if a gigantic flying saucer has landed and everyone wants to go for a ride in it. These large structures constitute the urban geography of Wichita, Kansas. Today in Lecture 5, we discuss the social structures that shape and define the contested terrain of globalization.
Hello, welcome to Lecture 5. Today we talk about global political structures and processes. I begin by showing you some images of some of the well-known landmarks in Wichita, Kansas. And they are large physical structures. And I'd like to talk about them as metaphors, just as we used the water and ice several weeks ago to talk about global solids turning into global flows. And as you may recall, structures are in the midst of those flows and they can impede or they can speed up those flows. So if we think about large physical structures, buildings in Wichita, certainly there are certain roadways and pathways around them and certain doorways and windows and so forth that we can access them. And so they impede flows of traffic and people. And I mentioned Century 2, trying to be a little bit humorous. But as you know, that area down by Century 2 and in Trust Arena for that matter, if you're down there when a concert gets out, you may wish you would not have taken that route because there are lots and lots of people, lots of traffic, and parking can be challenging at times. And there are many one-way streets, so if you don't know your way around those areas, it can be a little bit frustrating. So that's kind of the metaphor. Showing you some large landmark structures around Wichita, and hopefully they can help you think about the global structures that we'll mention today. And these global structures literally can impede or they can smooth or speed up the flows of people, things, information, places. These large structures have a very big influence on the way the world is organized, and especially politically. And so what we want to talk about today, our objectives, I would like to spend just a few minutes talking about the nation state and the origins of the nation state, because it is the primary global structure. It has been and remains the primary global structure. But we also need to talk about other kinds of global structures and the potential that they have for global governance, so big organizations like the UN. And while I'm thinking of this, when you do think of literally large global political structures, they tend to be organizations, some very large ones, or many smaller ones under the umbrella of a larger category. We'll go through some of that, but they are networks of people organized into groups to accomplish objectives, political objectives. And we also have to talk about then what emerges out of, in terms of globalization, what emerges out of civil society, which is the sort of non-governmental part of people and how they organize. And there are many international non-governmental organizations that can fill the gap or can do things that aren't being done by imperatives from these other global structures, the UN or nation states. So that's what we want to touch upon today. So let's talk about the nation state first. It is a social group. A nation is a social group linked through common descent, culture, language, or territorial contiguity. Um, Within the nation state, there is a national identity, which is a fluid and dynamic form of collective identity. So members believe that they are different from other groups, all right, and that they have in common with those of their own group. Nation states have a state function, which is an organizational structure outside other socioeconomic hierarchies, such as the economy, and they have relatively autonomous office holders. A nation state then integrates all of the subgroups that define themselves as a nation within the organizational structure of the state. So in the United States, you have all of these different subgroups within the individual states, organized into counties, into cities, and so forth. All of these subgroups are organized into the larger nation state. Okay, it seems like there would be no other way to organize the world than through a nation state system, but we do have to recognize that this is not a natural part of human evolution. The nation state is a social construct. It developed by groups of people getting together and making certain decisions through a series of events and actions. And although it can be hard to imagine how things would be organized differently, we do have to bear in mind we cannot reify nation states. Nation states need to be understood as a particular way to organize people. And unless we understand it that way, it can be hard to think about how to make changes, should they need to be made. So the nation state was formed with the Peace of Westphalia Treaty in 1648, which set up an international system recognizing sovereign states. So, it was a response to war, and it was a negotiated outcome. Basically, if you can imagine, neighbors are fighting, well, let's put up a fence. It's much more complex than that. But it basically set up a system where these states could be recognized and would have borders and would have sovereignty, and that, of course, nation states could decide what to do within their own borders, but they could not interfere with others. Okay, so the key question in the era of globalization is, to what extent does this nation state system, what extent is it as powerful as it was 200, 300 years ago, let alone 50 years ago? And are we at a time when the nation state will become less powerful than perhaps international structures? Okay, so that's a big deal, and that has a lot of people in individual nation states nervous. And I know we've talked a lot in this class already about nationalism. We'll talk about that as a response to globalization. We'll continue to talk about that. But that is one of the issues that in real life, in real terms, not just academically, that people are concerned about. Okay, because people are very attached to the nation state system and their national identity and so forth. But there is this tension with being a human being amongst many human beings around the globe, not just one in our, not just those in our own nation state. And we'll get to that. So getting back to the nation state as a construct, and it has to be constructed not only territorial and in the minds of people in other nation states in order to respect the borders of a nation state, but people within the nation state have to erect in their imagination this idea of a national identity, that they have something in common with all of the other people in their nation, and that this separates them from what people in other nations have in common with each other. So you have to have sort of a pride, a sort of glue that holds you together. And Benedict Anderson is the one who talked about this concept of imagined communities. And he talked about the importance of what he called print capitalism. So this means the sale of newspapers and magazines and so forth, because it obviously helps to be able to erect a national identity by circulating information and having people be able to read about it. So the more that you can read the news about your nation, as opposed to hear about, only hearing about the news in your particular community. Until they had print, that was a harder message for people to hear, and it was a harder national identity for people to grasp. So we have to have this sense of national identity. Your book talks a little bit about the evolution of national relations in the last 50 to 75 years in terms of nations relating with each other. And when we look at globalization, it's really important to see who the big national players are and how much political power they have. And during the Cold War, that was obviously, the post-World War II period was between the United States and between the USSR, of course, battling in the Cold War over capitalism and communism in the Cold War. Of course, we know that in the end, communism could not sustain itself, and at that point in time, we can think of political power in the world as becoming more unipolar toward the United States, but only for a brief moment, because China, of course, the economy of China gives them significant political power, and then the European Union getting together with all of those nation states. So now people are talking about it's China, it's the European Union, and it's the United States. So it's the big three. And this book was written before Brexit, so it will be interesting to see what the author and what the consensus would say about the EU. Or do we have to add, obviously, Great Britain and make it a fourth sort of polarization? We shall see. But importantly, this gives you kind of a sense for how we look at different nation states and different groups of nation states when we're trying to figure out, make sense of the world, what's going on in the world. There are many other different international global structures, and these are very large international organizations, and we can just name a few. The League of Nations is one of them. The United Nations is obviously the most well-known global structure. It's in New York City. It operates with representatives from almost all of the countries. It should be all of the countries. And it has a Security Council. It has a General Assembly, and it tries to make peace in the world and solve environmental problems, solve sustainability, poverty problems, a number of different things. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, is obviously one that's very important in the inspections of the Iran nuclear deal that has been made, for example. The Group of Eight is the 8 large countries that have gotten together for a number of decades and had meetings and decide how to make decisions that are in their best interest. I won't go through. You can read about each of them and their different functions. But the question is, are these global structures powerful enough to become sort of global governors? Can they globally govern as nation states become less powerful or alongside powerful nation states? And so Hale and Held have argued that actually that's what's been happening. Nation states just don't have the power that they had, and they are very connected, and there are many kinds of global flows, that call for international efforts. And so we see these multi-stakeholder initiatives to fight these big problems. You talk about the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria is one such initiative that involves many different kinds of stakeholders in the world, all putting in money and time and effort and trying to reduce instances of AIDS, tuberculosis, and so these are global problems, so we get multi-stakeholder initiatives. Climate change is another one you hear a lot about. Paris Climate Accord is one where virtually every nation except our own has signed the treaty, and they have agreed to reduce emissions in their own countries voluntarily. Of course, our country was signed on to it under Obama. Trump did not maintain that agreement. And of course, this shows you the tension between world leaders in individual nation states governing by what they think is best for their country. And of course, our country, our economy it's very dependent on oil and natural gas and fossil fuels that are not good for climate change. And so I'm assuming that Donald Trump, in making his decision, was looking at that. And of course, he has said himself that he's not a believer in climate change. So I guess it's kind of hard to sign on to something you don't believe in. But in any case, the rest of the world has decided this is too important a problem, and it requires international cooperation. We also have arbitration bodies now. For example, the World Trade Organization is kind of like a trade court. Apart from nation states, we have to talk about civil society, which is the part of society that collectively organizes apart from the government, apart from, it used to be the church, but apart from the rule of law authority. So people can organize themselves, and when we talk about a global civil society, politically, there are many international non-governmental institutions, many international non-governmental organizations. And these international non-governmental institutions have rational moral authority, they have power from being neutral, they are seen as being local and grassroots. Many of them had success, but there are criticisms. They include that many of these international non-governmental organizations are coming from the global north and reflect the sort of neoliberal affluence of the global north, and they may not prioritize some of the problems that need to be solved. The most pressing problems may be elitist or undemocratic. And they are also argued that we should not, in neoliberalism, these non-governmental organizations are becoming really important because the government's not able to accomplish the objectives due to the lack of funding and so forth. So this is a criticism that it's good what they're doing, but shouldn't we be having a more centralized government effort? Anyway, when you look at all of so let's talk about civil society, nation states, and other global structures, and climate change. So start with the United Nations. They have 17 Sustainable Development Goals to change the world. Taking drastic action on climate change is number 13. And you might want to go to the web and check that out. It's interesting. 17 Sustainable Development Goals to change the world for the UN. There's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So there's a big research group of many scientists from many different nations, and they have weighed in and said we need to take drastic action on climate change. There are many nations signed on to the Paris Accord of 2015 that I mentioned a few minutes ago. There are many environmental groups, these non-governmental organizations in our own United States. You might have heard of the Sierra Club, and that's just one of many different environmental groups trying to take action on climate change. One of the well-known joint efforts of Governor Jerry Brown and Michael Bloomberg is called America's Pledge to Reduce U.S. Emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. And in the wake of the United States, not signing, President Trump not signing on with Paris, there have been all of these other efforts within the United States where states and mayors, there's the U.S. Climate's Mayor Coalition of Cities and the U.S. Climate Alliance of State are deciding to try and meet those standards set in Paris or even go beyond them without the support of the federal government or President Trump signing on. And so there are also, multinational corporations both for addressing climate change and against climate change. Of course, you wouldn't expect the energy industry producing, fossil fuels and profiting from it to be one of the most active climate change addressers. And of course, there are countries like the United States. So all of those structures are in place when we're talking about the flow of emissions or reducing the global flow of emissions, greenhouse gases. Those are all, and there are many more, international organizations and nation states and non-governmental organizations. They are all in play. And we'll see what happens. We'll see if we're able to take action fast enough and minimize the negative impact of climate change, keep the global temperature down, or not. Remains to be seen. That's all for now. See you next week.